Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Last week we had a great conversation with Dr. Will Gervais, a cultural and evolutionary psychologist and senior lecturer at Brunel University in London, and a book he's just recently released, The Origin of Atheism in a Religious Species. And again, his goal in this book was to explore two entangled questions, two evolutionary puzzles. First, how Homo sapiens alone became a thoroughly religious species, and then, after spreading religion around the globe, how so many of our species managed to go against the flow and resist that evolutionary trait of religious belief. Will took us on a historical journey looking at how scientists and scholars have attempted to explain the origin of religious belief over the last 2 centuries. He first dissected and dispelled a number of myths and partial explanations from Karl Marx, from Darwinism, and from the New Atheists. We talked about Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Daniel Kahneman. Myths and explanations that really only either distracted the scholarly conversation over the past 2 centuries or looked promising at first but eventually failed to fully deliver once put to scientific testing. Will then took us on a deep dive into work being done over the past few decades by 2 groups of scientists. One group saying that the religious tendency in humans comes from our biology, and the other saying it comes from our culture. So that first group, the neurobiologists and evolutionary psychologists in their cognitive science of religion, looking at certain brain structures, neural pathways, reflexes, and signal processing, and developing ideas about theory of mind and mind-body dualism and agency, and coming up with concepts like hypersensitive agency detection, promiscuous teleology, intuitive creationism, and counterintuitive agency. And beside that mountain of data which they generated, there's a second mountain of data assembled by a second group of scientists, cultural evolutionary psychologists looking at phenomena that don't come up directly from our brains, our biology, but from our interactions in our culture. This second group talk about concepts like content bias versus context-biased learning, conformist versus prestige-based learning, and credibility-enhancing displays. We don't have time here to unpack any of those concepts and definitions again. If the listener needs to clarify any of those, I'd ask you to go back to the second half of last week's episode and review how Will put it. And if any listener wants to explore some of these ideas in even more depth than we did here last week, they can go to a thematic listing of episodes from our podcast archive and click on the collection of episodes under the theme Human Evolution, where we had other guests talking about hyperactive agency detection, teleology, symbolism, myth-making, the neurobiology of religious and spiritual experiences, which psychedelic drugs hijack, the mystical emotion of awe, and so many more aspects of the cognitive science of religion. But we left our audience last week standing in front of those 2 mountains of data, those 2 groups of scientists that we introduced to the listeners last week, and then we hit the pause button to give you time to digest all that information. And I alluded to the fact that it was like we had just finished assembling all the ingredients for a really great cake on the kitchen table in front of us, 2 big piles of basic ingredients, and then we asked everyone to sit down and catch their breath. This week we're going to see how Will puts those 2 groups of ideas together, stirs them up in a bowl and bakes it up to give us a dual inheritance model of the origin of religion and of atheism. Dual inheritance because, again, we inherit some of the contributing factors through our genes, which code for our brains and the biology, and the signal processing pathways performed by those brain structures, and we inherit other contributing factors through our cultural interactions, how we selectively learn from our parents, our peers, influencers, and leaders. This part of our discussion comes from the second half of Will's book that we, both Scott and I, found the most interesting, the most compelling and provocative, explanatory, and predictive about religious belief and atheism in our species. So as I reach forward to unpause the pause button, buckle up your seatbelts, sit back, and enjoy.
Why would they be engaging in all this kind of potentially costly behavior?
Right. Okay, so for the sake of time, let's now pull both of these together. We've just talked about those 2 mountains of data, the one from the cognitive science of religion, and then the other one coming from the cultural evolutionists. Let's now put these together. You did this in chapters 6 and 7. and you also did it in 11 and 12. You call this the dual inheritance model. And again, as I said earlier, this is really where I found the light bulb came on. I find that this dual inheritance model explains so much, not just how did religion evolve on an Earth millions of years ago when there was no religion on Earth and one species said, hey, religion, let's do it. But then also it explains atheism, the growth of disbelief in a world that's full of religious Homo sapiens. So tell us about this dual model of inheritance.
Yeah, so the model we've been working with is we kind of tried to keep what was worth keeping from cognitive science of religion, and we wanted to incorporate it within this broader cultural evolution framework. So it ends up looking something like this. So following what we learned from the cognitive science of religion, it does seem like we have some low-level intuitions and biases that really shape kind of what religions are about. So the gods of various world religions, they all tend to be intentional agents with more or less human-like psychology, and we can interact with them in various ways. That seems to be pretty universal, and I think very plausibly that's because that's a set of concepts that's a really good fit for our brain that evolved in a social species where we're good at tracking social relationships. But knowing that that's what religions are about, it turns out that that model doesn't really have a mechanism for explaining why anybody comes to believe that these things are real or not. And that's where we have to turn to the broader cultural evolution toolkit, where we can say, well, people are coming to adopt the beliefs they adopt through things like conformist learning, prestige bias learning. So if most people in our community are religious, we're more likely to be religious. If the leaders in the community are religious, we're picking up a cue that that's something that's good to be. But especially what we're cued into is credibility enhancing displays. If we see that the leaders of our community, most people in our community, are tithing, they're doing dietary restrictions, they're giving up a morning a week to go to temple, they might have limitations on kind of marriage and reproductive access. So we're seeing people proving their faith with their actions. That makes it more likely that cultural learners will come to adopt those beliefs themselves. Importantly, we need some consistency. So we've talked about kind of conformist biases. If everybody's kind of praying to the same God, that's a good cultural cue that I should pray to that God too. In contrast, if everybody's praying to different gods, I'm not picking up any consistent signal. So it seems like credibility enhancing displays are really important for determining which specific supernatural beliefs people might adopt of the various ones that we find easy to think. So I think cognitive science of religion is the key insight is that some concepts are easier for us to think, but that's not the same as belief. Cultural evolution helps explain the belief part. It says why people today in, say, the US are more likely to believe in a Judeo-Christian god than, say, Zeus.
Right.
Even though the concept of Zeus certainly was a good enough fit for people in ancient Greece.
You did that in your book, and I found that to be an excellent exercise. You talked about Mickey Mouse, the Tooth Fairy, and then Zeus and Yahweh, and you unpacked all of the things you just said in the past 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah. Well, part of that is, I think, with Joe Henrich a while back in grad school, we started looking at the cognitive science of religion model, where it's saying some concepts are just such good fits for our brains. And if you take that seriously, then you'd say, well, shouldn't everybody believe in Santa Claus? Because Santa Claus seems like it has the right cognitive content. Or shouldn't we believe in any god that we hear about that has the right contents? So Zeus clearly has the right contents because people believed in Zeus for a long time. So if I learn about Zeus, if it's really just that the idea is so sticky, shouldn't I start believing in Zeus as soon as I hear it? And clearly that's not what happens. So it's not just the case that the concept directly goes to belief. Instead, I don't believe in Zeus because I've never seen anybody engage in any credibility enhancing display of Zeus. Whereas if I grow up around kind of religious believers showing credibility enhancing displays, demonstrating faith in the same God, then that's a compelling kind of cultural cue that I should believe in that one as well.
I found that chapter fascinating as well. Very engaging way of pulling, the reader in to what you're trying to get across. One of the things that, in my thinking, like on Mickey Mouse and Santa Claus compared to Zeus, is the empirical side of it. So, for example, Santa Claus makes certain empirical claims that this guy rides around the world Christmas. It's not very difficult to disprove Santa Claus, as every kid knows. I mean, even young children start to say, well, how can you go to every house? Because there's an empirical side of Mickey Mouse. I think you could argue the same thing. But Zeus, now you're outside the empirical, right? So it can't be falsified as easily as others can. And I think you could say the same thing about Yahweh or most religions that abstract.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems like there might be sort of a like cognitive and cultural sweet spot for how almost falsifiable we make our supernatural claims, because the catchiest ones seem to describe a god that does have some interactions with the world. Otherwise, why would anybody care? But it can't get too specific. Otherwise, those pesky skeptics start digging around.
Right. Right. Yeah. Like the idea of miracles, right? But even miracles, in a sense, are not as easily falsifiable as a lot of other things because they depend on oral tradition. They depend on like they did that experiment in the US, the prayer experiment. They said, okay, let's put this prayer thing to the test. We're going to do this big thing. And they discovered that there was really no difference statistically between those who prayed and those who didn't. But I think a lot of religious folks are afraid of those kind of things because they would offer, direct counter evidence to their beliefs, and that's not necessarily a welcome thing.
Yeah, I think one of the nice insights of once you incorporate the cultural evolution framework is you can say, all right, let's imagine instead of trying to explain religion as a monolith, we can picture that, over cultural evolutionary time, tons of societies have come up with tons of different religions focusing on tons of different supernatural agents. And some of those combinations of supernatural agents and cultural practices and rituals work together well. And those religions have survived over time. But presumably there's lots of religions that popped up. Maybe they got a bit too greedy with their claims and they were falsified quickly. So that religion crashed out and we just haven't heard about it now. So when you think of religions as a lot of experiments going on simultaneously, and the big global faiths are the ones that have jumped through some hurdles and they're still going,
right.
That ends up being kind of a cool way to think about religion.
When you're talking about that, I'm thinking of some of the apocalyptic ones, especially, right? That they say, okay, the world's going to end on this date, and people go to a hill and so on, and it doesn't end. And that's happened several times. And sometimes that kills the religion. Like there are cases where that was the end of that, kind of thing. But there are other cases where it wasn't, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. They've survived that a number of times by reinterpreting and being creative, So it's fascinating to watch those gymnastics.
Yeah.
You covered that in your book, I think, when you compared Latter-day Saints and Shakers.
Yeah, in the book, we kind of tried to connect the dots between the dual inheritance approach. First, we started working at that as a way to figure out who's believing in which gods. But once you zoom out, you can say, well, which religions might be more likely to survive over the centuries? And so one way to think of that is religions kind of act as norm accelerators in a society. So every society is going to have norms where you're supposed to act this way and you're not supposed to act that way. And religions might be really good at just kind of amping up the stakes. So they push people to really, really follow the norms of the group, regardless of what those norms are. And then you can think about, well, some norms are going to be more conducive to group thriving over time. So if you have norms, for instance, that promote reproduction, that'll be good for a group over time. You'll have more people in your group. Or norms supporting, say, missionary outreach. Go to the people next door. Be nice. See if you can get them to join. Or we could have norms we don't like as much. We could have really militaristic and insular norms saying, don't talk to outsiders. Kill them if you see them. That could actually be a successful set of norms in some contexts. So if we think of all these norms as kind of different dials that can get turned up or down, it does seem like some settings, I guess, seem to go together pretty well and explain why these religions might succeed over time.
So what you said there, I just wanted to point out to the listeners to remember what you said about this machine with the dials, because I'm going to come back to that. I found that to be a powerful image that I thought really explained a lot. But that having been said, you talked about the Latter-day Saints and Shakers. One of the points you made, religions that tend to promote reproduction will do well. But those religions that really downplay reproduction, and that was the problem with the Shakers, for them, everything sexual was bad, and they just literally died out. They didn't have kids.
Yeah. That one, I can't even remember. I think in the book I had the Latter-day Saints and Shakers, they started around the same time. One of them practiced basically universal celibacy. One of them early on had plural marriage and has always had norms on pro-reproduction, pro-family, pro-missionary outreach. If you look over time, the Latter-day Saints are one of the fastest growing religions in the world. And there's like 3 or 4 practicing Shakers left because universal celibacy is not really a long-term strategy, it turns out.
Have you applied that to any of the majors? Like, in other words, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, how have they fit your thesis? Because there are obviously the religions that have, I mean, between Christianity and Islam alone, you've got probably at least half the world's population, maybe. And then, of course, you have to throw the Eastern religions in there as well. But yeah, so I'm curious if you've applied your thesis to any of those.
Yeah, so people who have worked on this area, I haven't done as much directly on this side of things. People who have made the case that what seems to be a good cultural trick for kind of stabilizing large scale cooperation in societies, it seems like large scale cooperation seems to hang together pretty well with religious beliefs about big moralizing gods. So gods who care what you're up to and might be able to police your behavior some way. There's some evidence, and interpretations always flip on this as new evidence comes in, but there's some suggestions that beliefs in a god who cares what people are up to, that might lead people to check kind of their more selfish impulses. And that's good in a social group. If people are
Right.
being a bit less selfish, good on them.
So this model, this dual inheritance model, explains so much about the emergence of belief in Homo sapiens and how it's propagated in our culture. But you also show how the same ideas can apply to this emergence of atheism in a world that is otherwise dominated by religious thinking. So maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so once the dual inheritance approach has kind of credibility enhancing displays installed as a key mechanism for kind of boosting belief, where cultural learners come to adopt beliefs that are credibly modeled by people in their societies. This also gives us a mechanism for understanding at least one way why people might end up not being religious believers. And that's just if you grow up in kind of a social milieu that's either just kind of lower in these religious creds, or if the religious creds are less consistent.
Just a note that when Will talks about creds, he's referring to credibility enhancing displays. Some listeners might not have made that connection or wondered if it referred to credentials. So when he says creds, he means credibility enhancing displays.
So, for instance, if you have some people are engaging in creds towards Yahweh and some are engaging in creds towards Zeus, then cultural learners are getting kind of a mixed signal as opposed to just no signal. And there's actually pretty good evidence now that people who experiencing lower levels of religious creds while they're growing up are way more likely to be atheists later on in life. So this kind of exposure to credibility enhancing displays of religion seems to be the single best predictor we've found for people not being religious. It's just people who mostly have received fewer religious creds growing up. That's not to say that that's the only way people become atheists. So in the book and in previous work with my advisor, Ara Noren Zion, we charted kind of 4 different ways people might become atheists, where we thought, all right, let's start out by thinking, if somebody's going to believe in a given God at a given time, what needs to be in place? Well, first, they need to be able to intuitively think about this God. You're not going to believe in something you can't kind of easily picture. So people need to have some sort of cognitive apparatus that makes it easy to think about gods. That could be some of the biases identified by cognitive scientists of religion. So they've specified that religion seems to be a byproduct largely of our social cognitive stuff. So theory of mind, things like that. That could mean that people who are a bit less good at high level mentalizing might find it harder to think about disembodied supernatural agents. So maybe that's one way people become atheists, is you just have a hard time picturing disembodied agents. The second way people might become atheists that we identified is similar to kind of what we were talking about at the beginning with the Marxist angle of religion is the opiate of the masses, the idea that there might be a motivational side to religion, where some people might just kind of not be into religion because they're not living in circumstances that make religion seem like a necessary, important thing to have. And if you look across cultures, it turns out that in societies with kind of high standard of living, equitable distribution of wealth, and a good safety net, people are just less excited about religion, and we tend to see it fade away over time. So some people might be atheists just because they grew up somewhere where most of their needs are met in non-religious ways. See a lot of that in, say, Western Europe, Scandinavia. The third way people become atheists is, as we were mentioning, it's they weren't exposed to credibility enhancing displays favoring one specific religion as they were growing up. And then the final way we outlined is sort of the rationality, analytic thinking angle, which is interesting because in chapter 3, I trashed that and I said, no, this is wrong. And then later in the book, I said, well, it's a little true. So it turns out when we look at kind of large scale aggregate evidence at what predicts atheism, the single best predictor is low exposure to religious creds. So cultural inputs seem to be the single biggest factor. The other factors I mentioned, they're all in play, but they're just way less important. So some people do seem to be atheists just because they score a bit lower on kind of advanced mentalizing skills. So it might be that it's harder to intuitively conceptualize of a personal God. Or, if you're living somewhere where all the needs are met outside of religious reasons, then you might be less religious just because your needs are met. Or some people might become atheists because they have engaged in this kind of effortful, rational thinking that we were talking about, with the caveat that the evidence there is really weak. So if we kind of had to look at these 4 pathways to atheism and ask which ones are kind of like the main pathways, 100%. It's the cultural stuff is always a better predictor than the cognitive stuff if we're trying to figure out who's religious and who's not. And that's counterintuitive to people who, say, read The New Atheist talking about how we became atheists by being so smart and being science-minded. It turns out the science hasn't ever shown that to be an actual strong predictor of atheism. And the better predictors of atheism are cultural.
So how does that correlate with those who are religious? In other words, that people become or are religious for very similar reasons that people are atheists?
Yeah, so if we think of those pathways to atheism, another way to think of that is those are just kind of pathways connecting atheism on one side and belief on the other. So they're kind of 4 separate spectrums. And so you can end up on the belief end. Again, culture is the strongest factor. The other one's a bit less in play. So really, it seems like it's creds pushing us either way, either towards atheism or towards belief in specific gods.
So in other words, often one of the arguments that people like the New Atheists will bring up is that if you're born in a Muslim country and raised in a Muslim family, you're going to be a Muslim. If you grow up in a Christian home and a Christian family, you're going to be, and so on. But they don't tend to apply that to themselves. And so what you're kind of saying is, well, it's really true of that of atheists as well. That's a major factor, not just the rational side. In fact, the rational side of it is on the lesser end of that scale. And that's a pretty radical thought. Have you got pushback on that from secularists?
Yeah, I mean, I get a fair number of emails where people say, "Oh, I quit reading your book at chapter 3 because I'm a rational atheist." And I'm like, well, you didn't want to read the part of the book where I explain where atheism actually comes from. You just noped out where I said your first hunch was wrong. And I get a lot of people saying I'm absolutely a rational atheist, and that's why I'm an atheist, is because I'm smart and science-minded. And again, I have to remind them that, like, I'm trying to explain aggregate trends. I might have gotten you wrong because that's how aggregate trends work.
Right.
But what's interesting is if you look at kind of the New Atheist narrative, they always talk about, there's people who are indoctrinated into some, evangelical, strongly religious, fundamentalist background. And then they discover Darwin and they think their way to atheism. But we've by now collected enough data where I can look in a nationally representative sample at the people who score the highest on religious creds. So I'm looking at exactly the people they're saying. So here's people with a strong religious upbringing. And then I can say, among these people, what's the correlation between analytic thinking prowess and religious disbelief? And it's zero. So among people with a strong religious upbringing, there is no relationship between analytic thinking and religious beliefs. That's not saying that there aren't people with a strong religious upbringing who became religious via analytic thinking stuff. It's just telling us that there's a lot of people who had a strong religious upbringing and are perfectly rational analytic people, and they've just turned their analytic faculties to other things other than trying to disprove God. These might be theologians. They might be priests. There's a lot of ways people can think very analytically and very effortfully about religion without arriving at atheism. Or they could be, strongly religious people who are teachers or lawyers, or they're engaging their analytic thinking in other ways. So really, I think in chapter 3, where I was talking about the myth of analytic atheism, there I was more pushing back on the new atheist notion that analytic rational thinking is inherently corrosive to religious belief. And we simply don't have evidence for that, scientifically speaking.
Right. Okay.
So everything you've been saying for the past 5 or 10 minutes has largely been about how individuals will lose that faith or will just become atheistic. But you also, in the book, you talk about how this explains societies and nations on a national level. You even talk about a 3-step process towards secularization. Again, I found that so fascinating.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we tried to pitch that 3-step process to secularism, in part because, like in the sociology of religion, there's a fair bit of work trying to explain how come some countries seem to be getting less religious and some countries are either staying as religious or, if anything, getting more religious. And so work by people like Norris and Inglehart, they have a book called Sacred and Secular, where it's really looking at kind of country by country, where's everybody at? What are the dynamics in play? And their kind of core take-home message is that they term it existential security, which is kind of a mix of societal health, wealth, education, safety net. It's just kind of a measure of how predictable and stable is a typical citizen's life. And it turns out that's a great predictor of declining religion. So places that can guarantee kind of a good, acceptable, minimal standard of living for most folks, religion seems to just kind of dry up. But we wanted to dig into what's the process where that happens. So there is this correlation where societies that kind of have more equitable development tend to be less religious. What explains that? So to link that with this dual inheritance and cultural evolution model. So first, as societies kind of accumulate wealth, assuming they pick the social safety net version of societal wealth as opposed to the billionaires in poverty version. But if you have kind of equitably distributed societal wealth, the first stage is that people just seem to be less excited about religion. So you might get a generation of kind of more private religious believers where, sure, they believe in a God, but they're doing less kind of visible public religion. So you see church attendance starts to decline, for instance, more rapidly than private belief declines. So you see societies get less publicly religious, even if there are private believers. Well, if we start thinking about credibility enhancing displays, if you're coming up in that society, you can't see people's beliefs, you can see their behavior. So if creds have dipped, it doesn't matter if everybody's a private believer. The cultural cue you're getting is that nobody's willing to act on these beliefs. So it's that second generation that's not getting religious creds. That's where we really see lower levels of belief across the board. So wave 1 is we see participation declines. Wave 2 is that belief tends to decline. And in the book, I speculated about it being kind of a 3-stage process because we're getting some evidence for now that even when you get a society where creds have crashed out and belief is low, it looks like there's kind of an intuitive good vibes about religion that seems to persist, where we'll have studies, for example, in places like Sweden, where religious belief is very low. And we'll have participants who tell us they're not religious. But if we do subtle experimental tasks to look at kind of how intuitively positively they view religion or how negatively they might view atheism, we'll find atheists in secular countries who intuitively show anti-atheist biases, which is odd. So why are atheists in the most atheist places still intuitively seeming to say religion's good? And that we've tried to explain by just saying, well, religion was kind of ascendant for millennia. And just because belief has crashed out since the 1950s, we shouldn't expect all cultural traces of religion to go out in the wash.
Right. So I began that question by saying that you have been talking about individuals, and then I asked you to address how this happens on a national societal level as well. And part of that, this is what really hit me when I was reading this part of your book, how this explains in my own personal life over 3 generations. So my parents, their whole generation, they got really wrapped up in the Jesus movement of the 70s and 80s. It was a passionate faith, an exuberant faith, and in-your-face faith, a very proselytizing faith. So that's them. That's the first generation. They raised a lot of kids, and I'm one of those kids that generation raised. And I look at so many of the other kids who, like me, were raised in that hyper-religious world. We've started asking a lot of questions. We've gone through a variety of life-changing experiences. And as a result, we've dramatically dialed down the intensity of that religion we inherited from our parents, that first generation. And we've really toned down the credibility enhancing displays. It's just not as all-consuming in our lives now. But a lot of us still go to church. We've moved toward a very liberal Christian faith, while, sure, some others in our generation have gone full atheist. So that's the second generation. And then I noticed that so many of us in my generation, we're all raising the third generation of kids who just don't go to church. Those kids will say they're spiritual but not religious. And they don't talk about any beliefs that they might have. They don't have any Christian practices. They're not anti-religious or full-on atheist in many cases. They're just apathetic about the whole religion thing. We did an episode not too long ago with Dr. Christian Smith, episode number 182, about how traditional Christianity has gone obsolete. So 3 very distinct religious generations in my own life.
Yeah, I think that tracks, and it tracks in the quantitative data in a lot of different cultures where it does seem like it happens in waves. It goes from kind of a generation where everybody's publicly religious to one where, I think my generation is kind of teetering, where there's a mixture of private belief and, yeah, so once participation crashes out there, that's where the learners are just going to have a hard time picking up the religious signal.
Right. And I just want to add, because I should have made that last point clear. So again, my parents' generation and then mine, where we are very, I'll speak for myself, chafing against religion. I want to hold it, but I can't, and I do, but I don't. But it's an active interaction I have with religion. But the kids that I see now being raised by my generation, those kids just go, religion? I don't know. No, I don't go to church. It sounds like it's a good idea. There's some good stuff in there. They're just very apathetic about the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that turns up in a lot of our data where to go on a bit of a digression, I think it kind of helps explain some of the disconnects people have when they hear like, okay, the evidence is saying that most atheism is coming just from cultural reasons, and it's not about this rationality. So why is it that there's this pervasive narrative that atheism is all about rationality? And I think it's in some ways just because that's kind of the most vivid example we have of atheists. So if people think about an atheist, they're thinking Richard Dawkins because he's the loud one. But most atheists out there are this third generation you're talking about where they're just apathetic. And apathetic atheists are not recognizable as atheists because they're so apathetic about their atheism, they might not even be open about it. They might not identify as atheists because who cares about religion? And definitionally, they are atheists, but they're also not going to be driving kind of culture as much as the loud, out and proud atheists.
One thing we haven't talked anything about it, where does agnosticism fit? Because it seems like that apathetic piece would really fit agnostics, and I do find amongst that generation, including in my own children and so on, it's more an agnosticism. They're not atheists. They're not saying, well, I don't necessarily think there is no God. I just don't think we can know, and I don't care. More like that. So yeah, how does that play?
Yeah, agnosticism is interesting, and what to do with the agnostics is something that pops up in my research a lot. And part of it comes from, I guess, how people think about measuring something like agnosticism. So one way it turns up in surveys is the survey might say, well, what's your religious identity? And then you've got, Catholic, Protestant, Sunni, Shia, atheist, agnostic, none, whatever else. And so people check a box. So that's kind of forcing them to choose between, are you agnostic or are you atheist? And I've tried to push back a bit on that because if you think about it, agnosticism and atheism are answers to very different philosophical questions. So agnosticism, that's a question about what can we know? So can we definitively know or prove that there is or isn't a God? If we're agnostic, we're saying, no, we can't prove that, which means that's a question of epistemology. It's saying, can we know? In contrast, atheism versus theism is a statement about what do we think it is in the cosmos? Do we think there's a God? Which makes it more of a metaphysical question. So since one of them is an answer to a metaphysical question and one of them is an answer to an epistemological question, I try to say, well, let's think of agnosticism and atheism not as discrete categories that might be mutually inconclusive, but rather they're endpoints of totally different kind of spectrums. So one spectrum runs from theism to atheism. That's, do you think there's a God? Then there's another spectrum from being agnostic about it to being more agnostic about it and saying, I think we can prove it. So we've done a bit of work trying to present people with those two separate continua and then having them rate where they are independently. And we've had some success with that, where it turns out a lot of our people who rate themselves more on the atheist side of the spectrum would also rate themselves more on the agnostic side of the spectrum. So it's totally possible to be atheist and agnostic. I think Bertrand Russell would have said that. He said, we can't prove that there's no God, just as we can't prove there's not a teapot orbiting the sun out there. But I don't believe in it because why would I believe in something without any evidence?
Yeah, I think a lot, even I think Richard Dawkins would probably agree with that. I've heard him say, I'm 95% sure there isn't, but I'm not 100% sure. You can't be. And going back to him, I think I'm kind of imagining how he would be responding to some of the things we've been talking about. But on the whole issue of, let's say there's no good evidence that people mostly come to atheism for rational reasons. It's more the other. However, that says nothing about the rationality of atheism.
Absolutely.
And Christians could say the same thing, that yes, most Christians are Christians because they were raised that way and so on and so forth. But that really has nothing to say about whether Christianity is a valid religion. That has to be decided on different terms. What do you think of that?
Absolutely. So I think we've got to set the rationality of the claims made on behalf of any religion or atheism in one camp, and then the question of whether rationality gets you to atheism is a separate question. So by now, our evidence is saying that rationality is not the way most people become atheists, but that doesn't mean we can then kind of make leaps to say that shows that atheism is more rational. And I guess one way to frame that, and I've had this conversation with people where they'd say, well, if rationality might lead to this, wouldn't that make that the more rational outcome? And it's like, well, people believe all sorts of irrational stuff. So let's not make what people believe the barometer by which we judge the rationality of things. People believe all sorts of crazy stuff. They believe all sorts of good stuff too, sometimes for rational reasons, sometimes for not. So we've got to separate rationality of the claim with, does a rational process get you to the end point?
Okay, so, Will, can I try an analogy on you, a metaphor that came to me as I was reading your book, the part of the book that we're now talking about? And I asked the listeners to remember that you made a reference to turning dials. That's where I thought, this reminds me so much of another context where I saw the same thing happening. So when humans began to understand the weather, before we understood it, we just thought, okay, this is all the realm of the gods. They're the ones who are creating the weather. They're delivering the weather. We have no idea what they're going to give us tomorrow. And then through science, we just learned about three variables: humidity, pressure, and temperature. So I'm picturing this box, a little box with three dials: humidity, temperature, and pressure. And you dial it a bit this way and you'll get this weather. You dial things a little bit differently and you get a whole different system, a whole different weather. And it's to the point now where the weather network has this box in front of them and they dial it in, they measure the humidity, pressure, and temperature. And then they can tell us, actually, guys, 5 days from now, there's going to be a major hurricane moving up from Texas and producing tornadoes in Chicago the next day, and then massive rain and high winds in Ontario and Quebec the day after that. Or maybe a cold front with freezing rain sweeping across the country and hitting the Atlantic seaboard next week. So much that can be predicted, explained and then predicted from this box with the 3 dials. And then you now have this box. This is what I was thinking when I read your book. I thought, here we have this box with a bunch of dials. I didn't really try to tabulate how many, but one big dial from culture and one big dial from biology, and then some little dials underneath there where you tweak in, credibility displays and content and context biases, all these little dials. And it just seems to explain so much about the emergence of religion over millions and billions of years, let alone in individuals, and then the emergence of atheism in a completely religious world. And so is it fair for me to make that metaphor, that analogy of what you're proposing here?
Yeah, I mean, I really like that framing of it. And I should say, too, that I found myself getting more persuaded by the argument in the book as I was writing it. So I started out writing the book. My first book proposals, when I sent them to my agent, his feedback, he came back, he's like, you do know a book is more than just like a list of facts, like you're going to want to connect these. So I was like, oh, shit, you're right. No, that's true. And so then as I kind of went through this kind of thinking about different dials that you could dial up or down, that on the one hand, that determines which religions might be successful over cultural evolutionary time. Or we can picture at the individual level, these same dials might determine who believes in a God versus who doesn't. So kind of as I was developing that argument in the book, I realized that a lot of my own research actually was more connected than I had thought of it as I was doing it. I always thought of I just grab a project because it interests me, and I never really thought of it having a cumulative progression. But then when you sit down and try to put it in a book, it's like, oh, no, actually, turns out I did have coherent ideas over the last 15 years. Good on me.
Now, I said the box with the dials on it has explanatory power. I think I also use the word predictive, but that's what I want to now ask you. Can we, with this box that you've put in front of us, can you make predictions? We've seen how it explains things in the past history, but how about future history? I've got a list here. I think, yes, from your book I got it. Marx, Durkheim, Freud, Jefferson, Voltaire. For centuries, they've all been predicting the death of religion is going to go away. And yet, here we are. We still have religion. And then one of the ingredients that you talk about, one of the dials on this box, has to do with a sense of security, a sense of peace, a sense of predictability. And we're now in a world, we think things are unpredictable now, but I can see the world of 50 years from now is going to have so much uncertainty, so much volatility. Does that predict that the world is just going to get so thoroughly religious? Let's talk predictions.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at all the predictions that kind of advocates of the secularization thesis have made over the years, where they thought, all right, now that we've got modernity and rationality and science, we've seen that religion is fading in some parts of the world. And it's those parts of the world that have heavily invested in modernity and education and science. So maybe if we just educate everybody and get more technology, religions will fade away. And as you mentioned, at the beginning of the chapter, I highlighted people over the centuries predicting that religion's going to collapse within 50 years. And it clearly hasn't. And I think that's almost like this myth of the rational atheist writ large, where they're saying, well, I'm a man of science and I'm not religious and science is getting better, so maybe everybody will be an atheist like me. But that's the wrong diagnosis for where religion comes from. And if we think back to that kind of 3-stage model of secularization, the first stage is just having predictable, secure living conditions for most people. So if we want to predict the future of religion, I don't think we need to look at predicting the future of science or education. I think we need to look at predicting the future of predictability.
Right.
Are we heading towards global conditions where predictability and stability are going to be the norm? My own predictions kind of glum on that one. I have a hard time looking at climate change and current efforts to reduce it or adapt to it. I have a hard time seeing us coming out of this with more stability anytime soon. I think we're going to have a lot of environmental fluctuations. I think we'll have a lot of political upheaval as different countries try to find different ways to deal with climate change. And so I think my prediction over the next 50 to 100 years is in most of the world, we're going to see more unrest, more instability. Religion's going to do just fine. I think we'll see some affluent countries trying to be walled gardens. And they're going to build that wall higher and they're going to try to keep the garden as nice as they can. And so I think we'll have pockets of secularism, and it'll be the pockets of secularism that we currently have.
Right.
But unless we collectively kind of chip in and say, hey, maybe we could do with having fewer billionaires and uplift kind of the mean standard of living globally. And if we kind of took care of each other a bit and then tried to figure out how to not boil the polar ice caps for a bit, maybe we'll get the stability that would lead religion to decrease. But I think right now we're kind of headed towards instability, and religion's going to do fine in most of the world.
Hmm.
So backing up just a little bit, I guess, but is atheism a religion?
I mean, if we're adopting a definition of religion that says it's kind of a communal belief where supernatural agents are involved, we'd say it's not a religion, probably. But I try not to get too hung up on trying to decide what fits in the religion basket and what doesn't fit in the religion basket, because in my work, I'll try to pick one aspect of religion to focus on. So sometimes I'm trying to predict belief in God, yes or no. So I would say atheism, just kind of writ large, it just means an atheist is somebody who doesn't believe in a God. That doesn't have to be at all religion like. But I think you can have pockets of fervent fundamentalist atheism that takes on all the trappings of religion except the supernatural. And it might replace that kind of deference to the supernatural with unearned deference to elites within that community. I think some people have an almost supernatural commitment to the rational atheism thesis, where they can see the evidence. I can present the evidence in the book, and they'll email me to tell me my book is wrong because they're so sure it was right.
Right. So maybe it's more fair to say, in a sense, atheism is more of an ideology than a religion, just like communism is an ideology, or fascism, or capitalism for that matter. Any kind of worldview, I guess, distinguishing them that way.
Absolutely. And I think even among the new atheists, when they're complaining about big religions, I think they're mostly complaining about the ideological aspects of it, as opposed to kind of the people privately praying and communing with God. I think nobody's got that much beef. And so it's almost ironic that some sets of that group have grabbed the ideology part and the tight-knit kind of insular community part of it, which is the part that they didn't like about religion. I don't know.
Right.
So, Will, we have covered so much material here. This has been an amazing discussion. And the thing is, I've got a list. We haven't even covered half of what I wanted to talk with you about. And you've been so gracious. You've given us 2 hours of your time. We're going to have to make this 2 episodes. But maybe before we draw a line under it, I just wanted to make sure, was there anything we didn't say that you would really like to have the last word on?
We've touched damn near everything. No, I feel like I'd just like to remind the listeners, I guess, regardless of whether you're a believer or whether you're an atheist, I think when you look at kind of the dual inheritance approach and realize how big cultural learning is in it, it almost forces some humility. No matter kind of what your background and your current beliefs are, if you realize that the primary driver of most people's religious beliefs or lack thereof in the world is kind of early cultural exposures, then it's hard to feel that smug about being the atheist, right? Like, you just happened to grow up somewhere where it was easier to be an atheist. Good on you. Ditto for, some religious people who might feel like we are God's chosen people. And guess what? If you were born somewhere else, you'd still believe that, but it would be a totally different set of beliefs. So once you realize kind of the big role of culture, I think it kind of forces everybody to step back and say, well, the beliefs I culturally inherited aren't necessarily better than somebody else's.
Right.
We've talked a number of times on our podcast about this issue of certainty, which is kind of a favorite of mine, that certainty seems to be the enemy of so much, where we're so bloody certain of things that in the extreme that will kill people, because we're so certain that we're right and they're wrong and so on, that, that whole issue of humility. And I really appreciated this discussion and your work, because I think this is the kind of discussion that can really move us forward in the world and prevent us from even from, killing each other and those kind of things.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that was interesting, talking about how certainty might be the problem. A bit ago, we were talking about how you could think of agnosticism as its own kind of separate dimension. And in some of our early work, the religious believers who are more on the agnostic side of the spectrum look more like atheists who are agnostic than look like religious believers who aren't. So having some intellectual humility and agnosticism seems to be good for theists and atheists alike.
Mm.
So I just want to say then, well, first of all, I want to say thanks so much again, Will. But I also want to say to the listeners, I highly recommend this book, highly recommend it. I think the only book that I had access to electronically to do this interview, and when I was done reading it, I thought, I have to get the hard copy of this book. I need to have this in my shelf. I highly recommend it. It is very readable. There's a lot of big words and a lot of big concepts, but I think it's all written at the level that the non-expert can grasp. And it informs, but it also raises questions and gets you thinking.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. I love hearing that. And yeah, we do cover in the book some kind of heavy theoretical terrain, but to give you an example of how I tried to make it read, part of it is I'm not good with scientific jargon. I'm much better at kind of shooting off the cuff. And so in the book, like if I'm talking about mathematical models of, say, group selection, in the book, that's introduced by talking about my favorite comic books. So
Yeah.
we're not hitting you with the math on all the big theory first.
Thank you so much. You have been gracious. You've given us twice as much as we expected. All the best. We've got to go.
Thank you so much to both of you. This is a lot of fun. Bye now.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.